Present the window. Hang on. Here's a PowerPoint. It's the 13th of October. This is Anthropology and Human Nature, or Human Condition, as I've renamed it a little bit. The lecture today is on Tristes Tropiques by Lévi-Strauss. I actually have to answer the door because, very excitingly, I think I'm able to get a copy of the book. So quickly have a read of this first slide while I just grab my door. No, nothing there yet. I'm promised that it's going to be delivered, and I just heard someone at the door, but it was my neighbors. I've been trying to get a copy of Tristes Tropiques in Tinh Viet. You see, that's what I think is getting delivered. So today we're talking about Tristes Tropiques. As I said, this is the one book. If you read only one book in this class, it should be this one, but I want you to read more than one, of course. I haven't been able to get a PDF in Tinh Viet of this book either. So the fact that it's about to be delivered in seconds, literally seconds, is exciting. Please do, I should say. Asking for it to be delivered. Because, you know, Tristes Tropiques is not his first book, but I think his best written book and most exciting book. There's a sense in which it anticipates all of his later work, although you kind of have to interpret your way into that. And the book's open to interpretation. In fact, there have been many interpretations. So I want to track some of that today as well to show that this book has changed over time, which is a little bit strange perhaps, but I think important. All books do, really, but the ones that really stay with us, it's important to recognize how they change over time. Anyway, Claude Lévi-Strauss does his fieldwork question of whether he does fieldwork is at stake as well. He does his work in South America. He gets a job after he's finished his PhD in Paris. He gets a job in Brazil. And then he spends his time going on expeditions into the Amazon interior. Hardly any Europeans had done so. I mean, some had, to build a telegraph line, the Rondon telegraph line. And there was the beginnings of what is now rampant capitalization of the Amazon rainforest. And of course, the people, even before they physically met any Europeans, they had caught contagious diseases. The nature of Europeans entering into the Americas was such that they came and lived on the coast, but some indigenous people met them at the coast and then went back inland again, carrying with them influenza, measles, diseases that the South Americans had never dealt with before. Their bodies had not built up resistance to these things. And so they were wiped out by the mere flu of the time, or with measles, or sexual diseases that were passed on. So these things spread. Western disease spread faster than Westerners, although that also did slowly happen. I say that only because that became a controversy later on when an anthropologist, famous anthropologist, is accused of doing experiments for the French government by introducing different strains of measles into tribal groups. And whether what exactly was happening there is all complicated and mysterious, but really controversial. About 10, 15 years ago, it became 20 years ago, it became a big issue. I'm looking at an earlier period. Of course, the Nambikwara, the Bororo, and people that Levi-Strauss met had also already met missionaries, had already been decimated by disease, and were already subject somehow to the effects of colonization and capitalism. But they were also still very much a village, tribal group, and their language, well, they were, because Levi-Strauss didn't learn the language, they were inaccessible to him. And yet he was still able to do some communication to, as we'll see, and as you might have seen from the reading for this week, from Jacques Derrida, which was The Violence of the Letter, which is two little stories, very important stories, really great stories, taken out from Tristes Tropiques and discussed in detail by Derrida. Now, Derrida was a French philosopher, student of Louis Althusser, and his commentary of grammatology was not his first book, but really is his first big famous book. Came out in 1967. There have been subsequently other editions. And of course, it was translated into English in 1974 by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who in other courses I'll talk to you about, but she's interesting in her own right. But Derrida's commentary on the writing lesson takes up a very important issue about the, not just for anthropology, for humanity in general, but also for the idea of science and knowledge. It's, where does writing come from? And what does writing do? And his first work, Jacques Derrida's first work, he's called Jackie in real life. When he was a kid, he was called Jackie. He took on Jacques when he moved to France. He was born in Algeria, right? So he was born in a colony. He was Algerian Jew. So caught when the Algerian independence movement, the revolution had begun, his family were caught between the French colonizers and the Algerian Muslim independence movement, and the French Jews were kind of caught in between, disliked by both sides. Quite often they went back to metropolitan France. But Jackie was really good at school and succeeded very well. He was really bad at school as well. He was a truant apparently, but he didn't want to be seen to fail. So he succeeded in philosophy and theory, did very well in exams, and so went to, well, eventually did well in exams. I think he had to take them twice. But then he went to study in France at the École Normale Supérieure, a very, very high level, prestigious school, where Merleau-Ponty went, where Sartre went, where Levi-Strauss went. And eventually he was taught by Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault. Well, he was a colleague of them as well. I mean, Louis Althusser was often ill, and his student, Jacques Derrida, had to replace him in lectures. Althusser was famous in France for being the intellectual, theoretically, the theorist of the Communist Party of France, and also a professor in the École Normale Supérieure, and but also manic depressive. So he was up and down, and often when he had these moments of going down, he was put into a psychiatric ward or a rest home for periods. And Jacques by then took over his teaching quite a lot. Eventually Althusser, never criticized by Derrida, but Althusser eventually kills his wife and is put into a psychiatric. He doesn't get charged for it, which is, like he says, is unfortunate. He was like in a psychological state, and his wife had, yeah, I don't want to get into this horrible and contradictory circumstance. Why does someone even have a chance to get away with killing their wife just because they claim insanity? But he was never charged, and so never went to court. Although he does get out of psychiatric ward eventually and writes a biography, The Future Lasts a Long Time, it's called, where he kind of, somewhat justificatory. I mean, he was obviously crazy, it's sure, but then violence against you. Anyway, before that, Derrida had been getting these jobs as temporary teacher, professor, and becoming more well-known, more in America than in France, actually, because he became more famous in America than he was in France at first, by the mid-60s. He did eventually finish his PhD, but not for another 10 years. But his master's thesis, well, the equivalent of a master's, I suppose, was sent by Althusser. Althusser didn't know how to mark it because it was so intense. And he sent it to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault said, well, it's either a complete failure or it's absolutely genius, and we can't decide. So they fell on genius, and the rest is history, as they say. Derrida died in 2004, I think. Produced about 100 books. I guess I've got about 10 of them here, and the rest, maybe 40 or 50 back in England. Amazing stuff, and so on. And Grammatology is the one of 3 that were published in that year, 1967. His first book was 1962, on Edmund Husserl, a translation of his Origins of Geometry. And why he was interested in that was to do with writing. We're making this a theme for today. In the Origins of Geometry, there's a small section in Husserl that Derrida then writes like a huge introduction to, where Husserl says that without writing, there couldn't be geometry. You had to have writing so that one generation could pass on what it discovered to the next generation. Think of, I don't know, Pythagoras. With Pythagoras' theorem, about triangles, and the hypotenuse is the square of the base of a triangle is the sum of the, whatever the Pythagoras' theorem is. Without writing that down or chiseling it into slate or whatever it was, the stone tablets, whatever they did for writing in those days, without that, the next generation would have to invent it again, or either hear it from oral history, and it, really, to make a discipline of geometry, you needed writing. So Derrida was really fascinated with writing. So then in 67, the books Writing and Difference and Of Grammatology and Speech and Phenomena all came out, and they all address this topic, what is writing and so on. And Of Grammatology is a commentary on, in large part, on Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques. Actually, I think we can show Levi-Strauss's book and how that's changed over time. So still hasn't come. These are the covers of the book, and you'll see quite a commentary there. Hang on one second again. Quite a commentary. I want to make a commentary, sorry, on these covers. I'm going to have to shut this window because of noise. Somebody's making a racket outside. I want to make a commentary on the covers just to kind of get into this issue of how the interpretation of the book changes over time. Now, at the beginning, we have the anthropologist in the field, writing his travel notes up as a book in 1955 and coming back and starting the book and saying, I hate travelers and explorers, yet here I am about to tell you the story of my expedition, right? And the book first appears as that kind of travelogue, even though he hates travel stories, right? And when it comes out first with Plon, it's got this image on the front. Have a look at that. Tell me what it is while I check again. So you see a face, right, and diagrams. And except not a face, this is Levi-Strauss's drawing, and some patterns on the face. So he's sketched what he sees, and it's obviously a human head, but it's not got human characteristics. In the English translation, first English translation, it came out very soon afterwards, we see what he's actually trying to draw. These tattoos, basically, that are on the Nambikwara people and the Barora people. They tattoo their faces in geometric designs. And how do we understand this? And it's interesting that this was the first theme that was taken up, is this whole issue of what is the meaning of these signs on, or these patterns on their faces. And American anthropologist said it reminded him of playing cards. And these playing cards are like the backs of playing cards. You know what I mean? The designs on, not the front where you see the Queen of Hearts or something like that, but these, where are they? I've only got the playing cards of my kids' collection of Alice in Wonderland, so you don't really get the back, the same style. But actually, someone could explain to me why. I've lived here 4 years, and quite often in the street near where I lived in Tanqui, and even now around here in Futuan, I found playing cards, not 50, not a whole set, but 1 or 2 thrown on the ground. Can anyone explain to me what that's about? It's not, it happens regularly. Now, I know in Apocalypse Now, there's a scene where the terrible general who likes the smell of napalm in the morning throws the card, the Ace of Clubs, which symbolizes his attack team, onto the dead bodies of soldiers they've killed. But I don't understand what's going on with that. Is there anything? Does anyone know? Please do. But anyway, yeah, the symbolism of cards is what people saw in this. And you can see maybe there's something like a heart and the kind of symbols you see from cards. Well, this is the Alice in Wonderland pack, though, my kids' pack. So this is the King of Hearts. We should be looking at the Queen of Hearts, really. She's the one, isn't she? Anyway, the style of the back of cards is what Clever Geertz, he's a guy who we read last week, right? Remember? Had focused on. I can find the other queens. There's the Grumpy Queen of Clubs. She's fantastic. But Queen of Diamonds, Queen of Spades, she's talking to Alice. This is an Alice pack of cards, right? So, yeah. Ace of Hearts, where's the Queen? She's been stolen. There she is. And upside down, so You can see she's screaming, Alice! No, no, off with their heads! That's what she screams, isn't it? Anyway, it wasn't though. That was sort of to make them just into playing cards didn't really help us understand them. And subsequently, these tattoos became emblematic of Levi-Strauss's interest in the structure of myths. And he became the theorist of structuralism. Right, so in this cover, which is a later English edition, or American edition actually, quite an early one, the face has gone and you just see a rendition, stylized rendition of the diagrammatic, right? So it has this little detailed part, which is like the lips or something, and then the bigger, almost letter-like symbolism. And what's important about this is, let me anticipate a little bit, is the diagrammatic structure. So there's a diagonal, and then there's two sides either part of the diagonal. One is a curve like that. One is a mirrored curve the opposite way with something else. And that will become significant when we talk about the structure of myths, which we'll do. But it started to become the theme that people identified in Tristes Tropiques fairly early on. So at first it was a travelogue. People read it before it was translated. When it was translated into English, by then Levi-Strauss had become the theorist of myths, and it was the leader of structuralism, along with Foucault and Roland Barthes and maybe Jacques Lacan. And then there was the post-structuralist, Derrida, and so on. But he was promoting the structural study of myth by this stage. And this diagram started to become, people started to focus on that as emblematic and saying it was already there in Tristes Tropiques, his analysis. But the people were also part of the scene. So the some of the issues, this is the abridged English issue, had the people and the diagram. Although this is a different diagram and a stylized one, and the picture is stylized as well. It kind of combines both. But the people that started to come in to the English version, this I think is in the 70s by now, and in a different time, I suppose there was a transition from being interested in the structural stuff, the diagrams, to being more interested in what he says about the people. When the Ting Viet version appeared, the first version anyway, had this cover, which is a contemporary. I mean, this is not the most recent edition that's out, but was a contemporary Amazonian native. And God, I'm getting all the interruptions today, aren't I? Now it's going to rain. I'm going to have to go and shut the window of my daughter's room. It shows a contemporary Amazonian who's got a leaf in their head instead of... But the current Ting Viet version, which I'm pleased to announce, has just arrived, so I'll be able to photocopy it in a little bit. I've just taken the plastic wrapper off it, so how about that for hot off the press? Is the translation, which has come out literally, it doesn't give a date for when the translation was. Looking for that, hang on. Yeah, there's no year. 2021. So yeah, newly translated, I guess. It's 2021, so it's just come out in a new edition. But interestingly, this version, last in my hot hands, so I can try and read it. It has all the photos. Wow. It's done good production of the photos and the diagrams. So you can see that one we've already seen, but also the abstracted diagrams. Okay. That's pretty much the one we've seen. And the structure of these things is quite fantastic and elaborate. So Levi-Strauss has drawn these to capture the diagrams on the faces of the Kudevo and Bororo Nambikwara Indians. I'll show you the Kudevo character. The tattoos aren't only on the face, on the body as well. And of course, they also use feathers and paint and so on. So yeah, if you're going to read one book, read this one. But this cover is really interesting because this drawing on the cover, or this painting on the cover, is not one of Levi-Strauss's, and they don't even quite look like any of the Amazonians, and they're in stone, which is slightly disturbing too. Like, this could be a bit of modern art, I suppose, from that region, but it's very stylized, and they look like, you know, exotic stereotype of Aurora. But by the by, the point is that the way in which we read Tristes Tropiques has changed over time. So this is the version that came out in English in the 90s, and it's there. It shows a lot of the Amazonians, Bororo or Kudevo, I don't know, in a very old, clearly old photograph, right? Stylized. They're in some kind of ceremony. They're probably being preached to by missionaries about Christ or something like that. I don't know. And the focus of readers of the book shifted from that structural stuff to concern about the ecology of the people. And this is another cover, a more recent French edition, where you have a picture of one of the, I think Bororo in this case, natives. And this is partly because structuralism was no longer a topic, so people weren't seeing the origins of structuralism in Tristes Tropiques, but they were seeing the origins of the critique of Eurocentrism, the critique of ecology, environmental, of climate change, etc. That Levi-Strauss is kind of a pioneer of. In a way, he's one of the first to really be criticizing, not the first, but one of the early critics of the way in which capitalism was throwing the muck of civilization in the face of its purest examples, or its most innocent. How he describes them is a little bit out of date, I think. But imposing the muck of capitalism on all peoples was one of the cries that's in this book. That this book is a kind of defense of, or a lament for the effect of civilization on the other civilizations of humanity, the other possibilities. And great to have it in my hands. So Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques was the foundation of his later 30 or 40 years obsession, 50 years obsession with mythology. But he started off working on kinship. His first book was The Elementary Structures of Kinship, which looked at the structures, but of the family of the Bororo, the Amazonian Indians and South American Indians, but also picking up on some of the work by Malinowski and by Baldwin Spencer on Aboriginal Australia, on the Arante people that we talked about in week 2, and Papua New Guinea, and the gift of Marcel Mauss, and then the work of Malinowski and the Trobriands. And it looked at the exchange, like Marx's principle of exchange, but as it operated in Neolithic societies and it was the exchange of women that was really defining in Levi-Strauss's analysis. He then did work on totemism. There's a book that's been in Tibet for a while already. It's one of the few that I did have already before this. And totemism especially looked at Aboriginal Australia, but also the Americas. What is a totem? Your tribes or your kin groups affiliation with a spirit animal, and how that's a nearly worldwide phenomenon, and it's reduced to a terrible thing in sports now. You have a team emblem, but really meant something to Aboriginal people through their dream time, through the mythological world of the stories they told about how the world was formed. And that led Levi-Strauss to, in two directions. One, to write about the terrible destruction that was happening because capitalism was invading the homes of these people that thought differently. And secondly, an obsession with the way they thought and how that was both not so different, profoundly human, and yet also interesting and needed to be protected somehow, preserved or saved or at least documented. And in 1962, 7 years after Tristes Tropiques, he brought out a book called La Pensée Sauvage, which translates in English badly as The Savage Mind, but that misses a part of the pun of the title, because La Pensée Sauvage also means a wild thought or flower. Nothing to do with savages in that sense. So there's, well, a little bit to do, but not intentionally. And there he uses a critique of Freud and Jung to not present a collective unconscious or archetypes of the unconscious, but to talk about a structure of thought, a series of oppositions that shape thought. And this was a framework for then his huge work that occupied him for the rest of his life, really. And he lived quite a long life, which was the study of mythology. A comparative study of Indo-European, American, and African myths, right, that he looked at in structuralist terms. As I said earlier, he was the theorist that introduces structuralism to anthropology, and one of the four great theorists of structuralism in France, along with Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault in history, Roland Barthes in literature, and Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis. And they mean structure in very different ways, but they got put together as the four that were promoting the idea of looking at structure as a way to understand how humans' society is organized. And for Levi-Strauss, it means collecting the myths of a people and working out how they're organized as a pattern of thought. And his idea for this really stems from the organization of the tattoos on the Kudevo, Bororo, and these people, right? Where are some of the other, right? So there's a picture, her picture, I think she gets photographed twice in the book. She's Kudevo. Yeah, I know her another friend. So there's hang on, her and someone like similarly tattooed. And these patterns he takes as a kind of symbolic representation of a world order. And let me try and explain this by making another pattern. Maybe actually the easiest way is to go back to that stylized cover. Where's that one that we looked at just there? This one. And say that what he looked for in terms of the structure was a pattern in the stories that he could then plot in a kind of map that looked a bit like the diagrams tattooed on the faces and bodies of the people. You maybe think this is a bit crazy, and he was, no doubt. But let's at least understand first what he's trying to do before we get into the critique. And how did he do this? Let's try and produce, or at least understand how you prepare a structural analysis. So what he would do was collect various material. So he understood the context in which the people were living and the versions of a story from mythology. And there are many stories, and you could collect different versions of the same story from several different tribal groups in an area. I don't know what a story would be. Let's take an example. The one from The Raw and the Cooked, the first volume of mythology series, which is the story of how humans learnt to cook their food. And so how did they get fire? How did they get cooking pots? How did they know that cooked food was safer than raw food because you could get sick from eating raw food? And how this made them human. And there were several different versions of the same story in which a jaguar features, actually, a big wild cat that effectively is like a god, and who, unlike today, is just a fierce creature in the jungle. In those days, was either the one who gave fire to humans, or the one from whom humans stole fire, which maybe explains why the jaguar, is so fierce and dark and a threat to humans, because he's angry at them for having stolen fire. So he can't cook anymore, and humans can. But what is it that makes humans human and know how to cook is that they were given or stole fire from the animals. And that's what distinguished humans from the animal. Anyway, there are various versions of this story. When you come to analysis, the structural analyst has to work out what's called the armature of the myths. Armature means the platform on which the myth is built, the structure, the underlying skeleton of the myth or the song. And this is where that pattern comes into play, right? The pattern of the myth, in a sense, is plotted out on a grid-like scale, right? So what he's doing here is looking at oppositions. So you've got raw food, cooked food, and putting them on sides of the diagonal. Raw food, cooked food, animal, human, healthy or full, satisfied, sick, something like that, and working out the forms in which these oppositions play out in the story, which part of the story they belong to, and the relationships between people in the story. So usually what happens is father and son are walking through the jungle, and the jaguar appears and gives them, or they steal from the jaguar fire, and then they bring it back to the people, and the people learn then all to cook, and they grow healthy and strong. A version, there are very many variations. So the relationships are looked at. And then there are parallel relationships that can be plotted on either side of the diagonal. Why it's always a diagonal, it doesn't have to be. It can be other patterns as well. But then you show the anthropologist, the structural analyst, wants to show how these stories move some of these oppositions in order to solve a dilemma or explain some practice or some rule, or explain the origin of fire, or why we have to cook food. And, you know, what's the shift in the story? Maybe the shift is the father and son who were really hungry, they wandered off into the forest, come back and are no longer any hungry anymore. Or the jaguar who offers the gift of fire, or from whom fire is stolen, goes from being a god to being a fierce demonic monster in the forest, or something like that. Now, but Levi-Strauss collects like thousands of myths from, they're all, he doesn't collect them himself personally. They're all in the Bureau of the documents collected from missionaries and traders and ethnographers, and over a really long period, collected by the Encyclopedia, a Bureau of Ethnographic Studies, collected into, it's all in the references, collected into a huge compendium of myths, right? In the 4 volumes of Mythologiques that are the famous 4, there are others, additional volumes. He refers to about 900 myths from the Amazon area, and then some from North America, and some from a few from China, and a few from Japan, some from Europe. Right? But he doesn't really say much about European ones and Chinese ones. He kind of wants to only show myths, or study myths that are definitely connected. So he's not like leaping about everywhere. He's sticking to the ethnography. It's quite crazy stuff at one level. And yeah, it's kind of not a surprise that people have moved on from studying this structuralism to look at what else is in the book, like the ecological dimension. I mean, more recent editions of the book, this is the Penguin Classics edition, really do focus on how, right in here, in this cover, you see it's an exotic person, a person with feathers and so on, but they're living in a place that's been deforested. So there's obviously some kind of recognition of environmental issues, climate change, and those sort of things. And the book is being interpreted now through that framework. Whereas perhaps with like the cover that we saw before, not that one, this one, it's more like the identity of the people, or even this one that was in focus, the identity of people, as opposed to the structural stuff or the travelogue stuff. So different times, in different places, the book is interpreted differently. Right, so this is a fairly older Penguin version. When what was in fashion was, this is I think the early 80s, was thinking of tribal people as the custodians of the rainforest, kind of thing, that they are the ones who really knew how to look after the rainforest, and capitalism was destroying the rain, and the cocaine trade and all of that was destroying the rainforest. But then later, I mean, the most recent editions of Tristes Tropiques that have come out celebrate Levi-Strauss himself. A picture of him at the time, but this is a much more recent edition of Tristes Tropiques, right? And after he's become famous, he then becomes the focus. And again, I suppose it looks at the travelogue, but also that he'd done this amazing amount of work, and so was recognized. And he does, the Mythologiques is 4 big fat volumes, 2,000 pages, some of them 700, some of them 400, 813 myths from North, South American, Indian societies, 50 myths from China, Japan, Polynesia, a few from Greece, Rome, and Christian Europe, right? Covering 350 tribes and ethnic groups. And it means he read hundreds of books and articles in different languages, and looked at inventories of animals and zoology and plants, because all these things are mentioned in the myths, so he had to know about the background, right? So he had to have in mind all the techniques and ecological, astrological information, because a lot of the myths are about when the moon went blue, or the full moon, or what do they call it, a super moon. Or you had to know some weather information. He combined all these things, and then also maps of where the tribes were, where they migrated to, and how they were related to others, both in South America and in North America before colonization, for cowboys and Indians and all of that. And had to look through all the old materials, engravings and all these different aspects to draw it into his amazing analysis of mythology. Let me try and see if we can, before we get on to talking about Derrida more, we can't do, actually we should talk about Derrida a bit more before we get into trying to do a mythic analysis ourselves of something. So let me shift out of this PowerPoint and share the Derrida text. The Derrida only takes up a small part of Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques, right? He only really, I mean, he's read the whole thing and knows Levi-Strauss's work very well, but there's 2 little scenarios that he picks up on that he makes much of, even though they're only moments, pages from Levi-Strauss's ethnographic diary, so to speak, right? As I said, Derrida is Algerian Jew and travels to France for his studies and becomes the assistant of Althusser, and in 1967 produces these three books. He started to become famous in America, and in a big conference in 1966 at Johns Hopkins, really made his name, where he gave a paper called Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Humanities, which basically said that it was a critique of Levi-Strauss's structuralism, that the idea that the structure could not stand, there was only play and in the structure. But what of grammatology is something else. It's astonishing. A book that I don't know, is maybe 800 pages, 600 pages. It's had different covers at different times. This one has a, is this Horus? I'm not sure. I can't remember which Egyptian god figure this is, in the act of writing some hieroglyphs, right? And hieroglyphs are your paradigmatic symbol for thinking about where the borderline is between pictograph and alphabet, right? An earlier English version of the grammatology I can't really show a good picture of it because I could only find it in Amazon, but the original translation by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak in 1974 didn't have the Greek one, it was this one. I didn't have the Egyptian it was this one, which I think is Japanese, and that's not going to help. I've clicked on that and I went to Amazon and a smaller image. Just trying to work this out. It looks like a kind of dragon creature. There's feet at the bottom, and then it's got a kind of dragon's head, and the body is made up of some maybe Japanese, I'm not sure, early Asian anyway, I think, stamps, like printing blocks. I don't recognize it as a language, but I guess it belongs to, I'm sure if I opened up the book, it probably says so. The more recent version of it doesn't say anything about, it's changed the cover again. I can only show you this. So it's got a book which has been made into an art object. Interesting. Anyway, back to grammatology. So the cover, the editions came out, translated by Gayatri Spivak. She was Bengali-born and educated scholar who left Calcutta in the 60s to study in America, and then got a job at Iowa. And once she was a graduate student or a new professor in Iowa, wrote to or saw the book in a book catalog for a publisher of French, and wrote to Derrida saying, I'm translating your book. Not can I translate your book, but I am translating your book, and asked him some questions, and he encouraged her in that and some other things later. And this kind of first made her fame. She's done more important work since, and some fantastic books and translations, and won awards, and is indefatigable. And I count her as a friend and also inspiration and teacher, mentor. But she wrote a 100-page introduction to this Derrida volume, which itself is amazing, and maybe set the standard for translation introductions. Nothing has matched it, really. Although in the squabbles afterwards, like there was a corrected text in this is the corrected text edition, corrected edition. This is in 97, I think. And then in 2014, there was an edition, 97. In 2014, there was that edition, the anniversary edition. And then some of the Derrida clique, priesthood, criticized some of the translations and some, but it's an amazing piece of work and an amazing text to study ourselves. And the bit that I've asked you to read is long. I apologize for that, but it's university. It's the violence of the letter from Levi-Strauss to Rousseau, mostly the part on Levi-Strauss. And it's part 2 of the book. In many ways, I think it's where people should start to read the book, because the first part's even harder. But there are 2 parts of this that I think are worth really focusing in on. And that's the first story about names. So when the anthropologist arrives among the Nambikwara, there's this thing called the Battle of Proper Names. And it's the first moment of a writing lesson. Okay, and if we scroll forward to the bit that's excerpted from the anthropologist's notebooks, there's just this one section where Levi-Strauss has arrived amongst the Nambikwara and settled down to take some photographs of them and write about them. But, you know, he doesn't speak the language. So, as he says, certain problems of language complicated matters. All right? Understatement. Absolutely understatement. He's traveled all this way to find the people that are untouched by civilization, and he can't communicate with them. Like, the anthropologist wants his anthropological ideal of some sort, is to find the people that have not been affected by westernization, and they all have. Already diseases, as I said, have moved faster than imperialism, but as part of imperialism. They've been decimated, and now they're living just off just nearby a missionary plantation, because they can get food there and stuff, and maybe medical help. Anyway, there's certain problems of language, complicated matters. Especially one was that the Nambikwara don't use proper names. They're not allowed to. So they use nicknames, right? And everybody had nicknames for them. At least the foreigners had nicknames for the Nambikwara. But then, here on page 111, one day when I was, Levi-Strauss writes, one day, this is in his notebook, one day when I was playing with a group of children, a little girl was struck by one of her comrades. She ran to me for protection and began to whisper something, a great secret, in my ear. I didn't understand. I had to ask her to repeat it over and over again. Say again, say again. Eventually, her enemy, her adversary, found out what was going on and came up upset in a rage and tried in turn to tell me what seemed to be another secret. After a little while, I was able to get to the bottom of the incident. The first girl was trying to tell me her enemy's name, the secret name, right? And when the enemy found out what was going on, she decided to tell me the other girl's name by way of a reprisal. And this is the classic. Anthropologists always pick on the kids, play the kids off against each other. Thenceforward, it was easy enough, though not very scrupulous, to egg the children on against each other until, after a time, I knew all the names. And when this was completed, we were all in another way each other's accomplices. I soon got them to give me all the adults' names as well. When this was discovered, the children were reprimanded and my sources of information dried up. Of course they did. All right. Ethically, scrupulous, not very scrupulous, sure. The anthropologist using kids as a way to get past the language barrier, interesting as well. To get the kids to do something that the parents wouldn't approve, and then that source of knowledge drying up, that sort of suggests that there's some full awareness of the danger of sharing too much with the French anthropologist. Derrida extensively explores this idea of naming and how naming is a kind of inscription and what it means and the violence of finding that stuff out. The anthropologists intervening to break the kind of taboo against the prohibition against revealing names, to violate the little girls. right? The first girl was trying to tell me her enemy's name. When the enemy found out what was going on, she decided to tell me the other girl's name by way of reprisal, right? So the anthropologist doesn't get punished, though. Only the girls get punished, which is also typical and bad. And in a sense, Tristes Tropiques is confessing that kind of violation all the way through. I mean, so much of what the anthropologist is doing contributes to the destruction that the anthropologist is complaining about and he's sad about in Sad Tropic, Tristes Tropiques. But it's not the last scene that Derrida talks about. The next one, a bit further on, is called the writing lesson. It's a different section, but it's definitely related. Okay, so it's the section called Writing and Man's Exploitation by Man, Human by Human. Let's include the women. It's the section in Tristes Tropiques called the Writing Lesson. And what I'm going to try and do is make a PDF out of that section so I can put it onto the e-learning. But it's this little section which Derrida admits it's unfair to pick on a travel journal, and yet then he does. And this little bit is again excerpted from Levi-Strauss's notebook. Right? And it's where he's actually about to leave the Nambikwara, right? And he's about to leave, and it's about his relationship with the chief of Nambikwara. He distributes pens and paper. Come here, you. Come here. Excuse me. My little Nambikwara is causing a bit of a ruckus. Are you a bit bored? Can you take pens and paper and do drawing in your room? Okay. All right, take that book, take some pencils, and stop making noise right for me. Sorry about this. Good girl. Rolling around on her skateboard. Levi-Strauss hands out pens and paper to the Nambikwara, but as he says, they're not able to draw except for a few dots and zigzags on their calabashes. What's a calabash? I believe it's their, like, not a shield, but they carry a bit of equipment, and they decorate them. And of course, the Nambikwara don't do tattooing. That's a kudeva, but anyway, he distributes paper and pencil, and they all start drawing wavy lines, and they even have a word for this, which is drawing lines, right? Their word for writing. Derrida pauses and says, you know, we don't want to make a big fuss about whether or not having a word for writing, drawing lines, really tells us anything. Just because they call it drawing lines, what if we call it scratching or engraving or scribble, to scrape, to trace, to imprint? There are so many different words that could mean the same thing. That the exact semantic reference is arbitrary. That's a big thing about language, and Derrida's commentary goes, like Levi-Strauss's, back to Saussure, whose course on general linguistics talked about the sign, the signifier, and the signified, and their relatively arbitrary connections. Do I have to? Yeah, I should. Right, so we use metaphor for all meaning, basically. And the sign of something and what it signifies is not necessarily connected. We call I don't know, we talk about a queen, all right? When we talk about the Queen of England or something, we talk about the Queen's power, we talk about the crown. There's a queen with a crown, all right, to get back to the cards. In this card, we call her actually, we use Q for queen. We know what the Queen of Hearts is. But when we talk about the kings and queens of England, we call them the crowned heads. Or we talk about the power of the king or queen, Queen Elizabeth in England, we talk about the crown. The crown thinks this, the crown that. That's a form of metaphor. Actually, a specific form of metaphor, that's called synecdoche, where a part stands for the whole. Like when you say there's 100 sail of ships, that means there's 100 ships, but you're using the sail as a signifier of the whole boat. Or we talk about 100 head of cattle. 100 head, that means you're counting their heads. You don't count their whole body. It's a synecdochic metaphor. But all language has these connections that are arbitrary. Different kinds of metaphors. You can read about this in the great Don Miller's work, The Reason of Metaphor, The Reason of Politics, Sage, 1982, where we have different forms of metaphor. Like it's a metaphoric relationship that we draw when we use Alice in Wonderland as a story that's a kind of allegory for working out our own troubles, fantasies, dilemmas, about being late, about being bored with bourgeois tea parties, or the dangers of royalty, or off with their heads, says the Queen. An allegory doesn't have anything to do with what it's directly to do with what it's really telling you about, but you can read into that story so many things, as the myths, and even metaphor, the language of the metaphoricity of all language. So we call this a pen, but there's no strict connection, or in Tingviet we call it boot, right? There's no strict connection between the sound, boot, or pen, the words, the letter shape, P-E-N or B-H-U-T. There's no reason to connect those things. And this object, we could easily have called this banana. And if we agreed to call it banana, we'd all know that a banana is something you write with, right? But it's not called banana, it's called pen, and it's related to pencil, and it's related to a set of pens, and it's related to objects. You can also include bananas in the whole set, but that's completely arbitrary. What you've actually called this thing, and what you've called that yellow bent thing that we eat, and what you've called a phone or a card or a book, sak, kitab, what's other words for book, buka. There's no direct correlation between the sound shape, what that signifies in the language, the letters, and the thing signified, right? That's the theory of general linguistics from Saussure, and so many different permutations of it over 1922, the same year as Malinowski's Argonauts. A course in general linguistics came out. What a great year. Also Ulysses from James Joyce. But I think, but yeah, and 100 years of study of that since. We agree in our different languages to call these things pens or boot, or call these things sak or book or kitab, or tome, or we have many words for them. All of them are, well, sometimes we have things called onomatopoeic. And that's a kind of metaphor as well. Onomatopoeic, Greek word for the word sounds like what the thing does. So here's one, scissors. And scissors in English, the sound of the word scissors sounds a little bit like the sound they make when you're cutting. Scissors, not really, but it's almost onomatopoeic. And there are other onomatopoeic words. But again, that's an arbitrary relation. So calling something drawing lines and saying that's different to the word writing, you don't know whether the semantic scope of drawing lines, or iakaria keredutsu, or whatever that is the same as writing. It might be writing in a more expanded sense. And Derrida has a concept of writing in a more expanded sense that will include any kind of inscription of meaning. Or writing in the sense of it must be writing, not hieroglyphs, not kanji or something like that. It might be more like scribble. These things don't necessarily match up from language to language perfectly. That's part of the joy of translation, or the horror of translation as well, that the idiomatic of each language is specific. Anyway, this is going on in this scene, and Derrida is getting to this point where Lévi-Strauss then tells the story of the chief of the Nambikuara, who uses writing in a sense, in this wider sense, when Lévi-Strauss is about to leave, he assembles everyone, and Lévi-Strauss is about to give everyone gifts to leave, and the chief intervenes and says, right, he pulls out from the basket a piece of paper covered with these scribbled lines, or covered with writing, you might say, but they were just scribbled lines, and he pretends to read from it, hesitates or pretends to hesitate, and then looks up and down his list for the objects to be given in exchange for his people's presence. So for a bow and arrow, from this one member of the Nambikuara, for a machete, the anthropologist's gift of a machete. He controls the giving of presents, basically. He persuades them that it was his relationship with the anthropologist that was responsible for the presents, for the exchange, right? So he's controlled the situation. And unfortunately, soon after, apparently, he loses his position as head of the tribe because they didn't approve of him doing that. But by the by, Lévi-Strauss then sits back and thinks about this, and he describes the appearance of writing, the secret of writing. Its real power is not the formation of letters and words, but its use in politics, its administrative use. And he thinks about that and describes that. And Derrida critiques that, questions that, and it's interesting. And the other aspect is how this is the function of writing in producing knowledge, a tactical use of knowledge, right? And then that allows Derrida to think a lot about how Lévi-Strauss's own critique in this book of how the West has brought its civilization mongering to all the peoples of the world and thrown it in their face like so much detritus and just rubbish piled up in the face of mankind. It's a phrase from the book. And Lévi-Strauss's criticism of ethnocentrism, thinking that your civilization is the center of the world and not respecting others, is actually also an ethnocentrism. At the very moment where he is being against ethnocentrism, he's imposed on these people without writing a very Western ethnocentric notion of what writing is and whether or not these people have writing, because earlier they had secret names, so they did have a structure. If you've got secrets, you've got a knowledge system, you've got a structure, you've got the game of politics of knowledge. It didn't just appear amidst them with this moment of pulling out the piece of paper and copying what the anthropologist had been doing. When the anthropologist writes wavy lines, they maybe should be respected for already having a structured system. And actually the later work of Lévi-Strauss in Mythologiques is all to do with that, is finding this in these analyses of myth, in the 4 volumes of myth, the power of these metaphors and allegories and the organization of these stories, which present people with their values. Anyway, I can tell from my voice that I've spoken far too long. What time is it? It's time to stop and have a break and a change of direction. After a break, and I'll give you some time to fill out the questions on the reading, we'll then do an analysis of our own, a structural analysis of the story of Snow White. I've done this before, so we'll be able to go through it a bit quicker, but focusing on how to do a structural analysis. And we'll see if we've got time for a bit more than that. Okay, so I think